The diesel engines rumbled beneath his boots, a constant mechanical heartbeat that had become as familiar as breathing. It was the 13th of August, 1940, and Kapitänleutnant Otto Kretschmer stood in the conning tower of U-99, his fingers lightly gripping the cold steel rim of the hatch. The Atlantic spread before him like hammered pewter under a moonless sky, the surface chopped and restless, each wave crest catching fragments of starlight before vanishing back into darkness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The air here, 200 miles west of Ireland, carried the metallic tang of salt and diesel exhaust, a scent that clung to everything, from the leather of his jacket to the wool of his cap. Below deck, the narrow corridors of the submarine smelled of unwashed bodies, machine oil, and the faint sweetness of mold growing in places the crew could never quite reach. But up here, in the open night, there was only wind and water, and the low mechanical growl of the diesels pushing them forward at 17 knots. His crew had been trained in the doctrine of stealth, taught that a submarine's greatest weapon was invisibility, that survival depended on diving deep and attacking from the silent depths where hydrophones could not find them. They had been drilled on submerged approaches, on firing solutions calculated in the cold mathematics of gyroscope angles and torpedo depth settings. But tonight, like so many nights since July, Kretschmer would do something that would have seemed madness to the instructors at the submarine school in Kiel. He would attack on the surface. He would drive his submarine, diesel engines roaring, directly into the heart of the convoy. The lookouts beside him scanned the horizon with binoculars, their eyes trained for the telltale smudge of smoke, the geometric irregularity of masts and funnels against the natural chaos of the sea. One of them stiffened, then spoke quietly. "Smoke. Bearing 280. Multiple ships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." Kretschmer raised his own binoculars. There, perhaps 12 miles distant, the darkness betrayed a presence. A slight thickening of shadow, the faint glow of exhaust gases mixing with sea mist. British, almost certainly, bound for Liverpool or Glasgow with the grain and steel and oil that kept the island nation alive. 40 or 50 merchant ships, lumbering along at 8 or 9 knots, their holds laden with cargo purchased with American dollars and sailing under the protection of perhaps 3 or 4 escorts. The mathematics of submarine warfare had been written by Admiral Karl Dönitz himself, calculated in the stark efficiency of tonnage sunk versus U-boats lost. For years, the accepted wisdom had been straightforward. Submarines were ambush predators, lying in wait beneath the waves, firing torpedoes from periscope depth before diving deep to escape the inevitable counterattack. Submerged attacks were doctrine, written into every training manual, practiced in every war game. But Kretschmer and his fellow commanders had discovered something the manuals had not anticipated. Something that turned conventional wisdom on its head and transformed the submarine from a hesitant stalker into a bold raider. They had discovered that attacking on the surface was not suicide, it was victory. The U-boat, for all its reputation as an underwater weapon, was in truth a surface vessel that could dive. Its Type 7 hull, 220 feet of welded steel plate, displaced 769 tons and was powered by 2 supercharged diesel engines that could push it to 17 knots on the surface. But submerged, running on electric motors powered by massive banks of lead-acid batteries, its speed fell to 7.5 knots and then only for short bursts. Crews submerged at 4 knots, and the batteries would last perhaps 18 hours before the boat would have to surface anyway, gasping for air like a drowning man, diesels gulping oxygen to recharge the cells that gave it underwater life. This was the fundamental truth of the diesel-electric submarine. It was fast on the surface and slow below. 17 knots versus 7. more than twice as fast in the open air than in the depths. And in the summer and fall of 1940, this simple fact of engineering physics was rewriting the rules of naval warfare in the Atlantic. The British had ASDIC, the underwater sound detection equipment they had developed after the last war, devices that could send pulses of sound through the water and listen for the echo bouncing back from a submerged hull. ASDIC could find a submarine at depths of 200 feet, could track it through the dark water and guide depth charges to rain down from the surface. But ASDIC had a fatal limitation. It could only detect submarines that were underwater. On the surface, a U-boat was invisible to ASDIC, just another small ship in a vast ocean, indistinguishable from a fishing trawler or a patrol boat in the confused returns of wave and current. And at night, in the darkness that came early to these northern latitudes in autumn, a surfaced submarine became almost impossible to see. The U-boat's low profile, its conning tower rising barely 15 feet above the water, created a silhouette that melted into the wave patterns. The lookouts aboard British merchant ships and destroyers strained their eyes for the tall funnels and masts of surface raiders, for the distinctive shapes of German capital ships. They were not looking for something low and dark and small that could slip between the columns of merchant vessels like a wolf among sheep. Ordered a change of course, bringing U-99 onto an intercept bearing. The convoy would pass to the north in perhaps 2 hours. He would position his submarine ahead of their track, then turn and approach from astern, from the blind spot where lookouts rarely searched, where the phosphorescent wakes of 40 ships churned the water into confusing patterns of white foam that would mask his approach. This was the tactic that Kretschmer and other commanders like Günther Prien and Joachim Schepke had perfected in the months since France fell. It was brutally simple. Use the submarine's superior surface speed to overtake the convoy. Racing ahead while still beyond visual range, navigating by dead reckoning and the smoke trails that betrayed the convoy's position and course. Then turn and attack from astern, approaching at high speed, weaving between the merchant ships while they were still unaware of the threat. Fire torpedoes at point-blank range, sometimes from less than 500 yards, so close that the magnetic pistols in the warheads could feel the steel hulls of their targets and detonate without even needing to strike. Then wheel away into the darkness, reload, and attack again. The British convoy system, developed painfully through the First War and implemented again in this one, had been designed to counter the lone wolf submarine attacking from periscope depth. Merchant ships sailed in columns, with escorts positioned ahead and on the flanks, ready to race toward any periscope sighting or ASDIC contact. When a submarine fired its torpedoes, the escorts would converge on the point of origin, dropping depth charges in patterns designed to crush the pressure hull, or at least force the U-boat to dive so deep it would lose contact. But those tactics assumed the submarine was submerged. They assumed it would fire from a distance and then flee into the depths. They did not account for a submarine that came from behind, on the surface, at 17 knots, diesel engines roaring loud enough to be heard for miles, but masked by the greater noise of 40 merchant ships laboring through the Atlantic swell. Below, in the control room, the crew waited with the tense patience of men who had done this before. The torpedo room crews stood ready, 4 torpedoes loaded in the forward tubes, 1 in the stern tube, each weapon a 21-inch diameter cylinder of steel packed with 500 pounds of high explosive and driven by an electric motor that would propel it at 30 knots through the water. The engineering ratings monitored the diesels, watching oil pressure and temperature gauges, ready to respond if the captain called for maximum speed or an emergency dive. They were volunteers, every one of them. Men who had chosen this service knowing its reputation for danger and discomfort. Life aboard a U-boat was misery refined to its essence. The interior of the pressure hull was a maze of machinery and equipment. Pipes and valves and electrical cables running along every surface, leaving barely enough space for men to squeeze past each other in the narrow passages. The air was thick and heavy, the ventilation inadequate even on the surface, the temperature in the engine room climbing past 100 degrees when the diesels ran hard. There was no privacy, no quiet, no escape from the smell of diesel fuel and human sweat, and the chemical toilets that could only be used when the submarine was on the surface and the complicated valves properly aligned. Fresh water was rationed to a few cups per man per day. Food began as fresh bread and vegetables, and within a week degenerated to canned goods and hard biscuits, eaten cold because using the galley stove filled the already stifling air with even more heat and smoke. But they endured it because they were winning. In the 4 months since July, German U-boats operating from the French Atlantic ports had sunk nearly 300 Allied merchant ships, over 1.5 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom. Commanders like Kretschmer were becoming famous, celebrated in the German press, awarded decorations by the Führer himself. Prien had sunk the battleship Royal Oak inside Scapa Flow. Schepke had destroyed ship after ship in bold night attacks. And Kretschmer, the quietest and perhaps deadliest of them all, had developed the tactic of penetrating the convoy itself, firing from inside the formation where escorts could not risk depth charges that might hit their own ships. The submariners called it the happy time, die glückliche Zeit, a period of easy hunting and spectacular success, when the odds finally seemed to favor the hunters rather than the hunted. 2 hours passed. Kretschmer tracked the convoy by its smoke, occasionally catching glimpses of masts and funnels silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness to the north. U-99 maintained 17 knots, vibrating steadily under the strain of maximum speed, the diesels consuming fuel at a prodigious rate, but gaining the position Kretschmer needed. When he judged he was far enough ahead, he ordered a course change to the south, then slowed to match the convoy's speed, letting it catch up. The moon remained hidden behind clouds. Perfect. In full moonlight, even a surfaced U-boat could be spotted, its wake visible from miles away. But tonight the darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by stars that appeared and disappeared as clouds scudded overhead. The wind was picking up, driving waves to 6 and 7 feet, enough to make the lookouts grip their binoculars tighter, but not enough to force a retreat. At midnight, Kretschmer began his approach. He turned U-99 to intercept the convoy from astern, angling to come up between 2 columns of merchant ships. The sound of the convoy reached him first. A deep collective rumble of steam engines and churning propellers, overlaid with the higher-pitched whine of turbines and the occasional hoot of a steam whistle. Then shapes began to resolve from the darkness. The convoy was arrayed in 8 or 9 columns, ships spaced about half a mile apart in each column, columns separated by perhaps 1,000 yards. The escorts, 3 destroyers, and 2 corvettes from what Kretschmer could see, patrolled ahead and on the flanks, exactly where doctrine said they should be. He chose his entry point carefully, steering for the gap between 2 merchant ships in the leftmost column. U-99 slipped between them like a ghost. Close enough that the lookouts could see the dark hulls rising above them, close enough to hear voices from the deck watchers, snatches of conversation in English carried on the wind. The merchant sailors did not see the low, dark shape passing between their ships. They were watching for aircraft, for surface raiders, for the distant flash of gunfire. Inside the convoy now, Kretschmer reduced speed to match the merchant ships. U-99 crept forward, moving up between the columns, the torpedo officer plotting firing solutions for target after target. The first ship, a large freighter of perhaps 8,000 tons, presented her port side. Range: 600 yards, Tube 1. Fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The torpedo left the tube with a pneumatic hiss, compressed air ejecting it into the sea. The electric motor engaged immediately, propelling the weapon forward at 30 knots, running at a depth of 10 feet, its gyroscope holding it on course toward the target. 20 seconds later, the warhead struck just aft of midships, the magnetic pistol detonating the explosive charge an instant before physical contact. The blast tore through the hull plates, opening the freighter's side to the sea. The explosion was a deep, hollow boom that rolled across the water. Men shouted. Steam whistles shrieked alarm. Aboard the stricken freighter, the crew scrambled for the lifeboats, knowing from bitter experience that a ship this size would sink in minutes once the sea reached the engine room. The escorts reacted immediately, racing toward the position where the torpedo appeared to have originated, sonar operators searching for the submarine they assumed must be submerged and fleeing, but Kretschmer had already moved on. He turned U-99 to present the stern tube, selected a second target, a tanker this time, her deep-loaded hull sitting low in the water. The torpedo ran true. The tanker erupted in flame as the explosion ignited her cargo of fuel oil, turning her into a floating bonfire that lit the night for miles around. Now the convoy scattered. Individual ships turned left and right, captains making desperate attempts to avoid whatever threat they could not see. The escorts dropped depth charges on imaginary contacts, the weapons detonating deep beneath the surface, sending geysers of white water into the air. But U-99 remained on the surface, weaving between the panicked merchant ships, reloading tubes, selecting new targets. By dawn, when Kretschmer finally withdrew and dived to spend the day on the bottom, he had sunk 5 ships totaling 30,000 tons. U-99 had not been detected, not been attacked, had suffered no damage beyond a few dents in the pressure hull from minor collisions with debris in the water. It had been, by the standards of the time, a perfect attack. A textbook demonstration of the new tactics that were devastating Allied shipping. The British Admiralty knew something had changed. The loss rates in autumn 1940 were unsustainable. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than new ones could be built. The convoy system that had worked reasonably well in the First World War was failing against this new form of attack. Intelligence reports and survivor accounts began to reveal the pattern. U-boats attacking at night, on the surface, penetrating the convoy formations themselves. The problem was straightforward, but the solution was not. ASDIC could not detect surface targets. Visual lookouts could not see low-profile submarines in darkness. Radar existed, but the early sets were primitive, unable to reliably detect small targets at useful ranges. The escorts were positioned to counter submerged attacks from outside the convoy, not surface attacks from within. And the U-boats, operating from French ports now, could reach far into the Atlantic, beyond the range of British aircraft based in England or Iceland. For the merchant sailors, the men who actually sailed the ships that carried the cargo, the situation was terrifying. Every night was a potential death sentence. The torpedo could come without warning, the first indication of danger being the explosion that tore open the hull. In the North Atlantic in autumn and winter, survival time in the water was measured in minutes. Even if you reached a lifeboat, you faced days or weeks adrift in storms and cold before rescue might come, if it came at all. The psychological toll was immense. Men signed on for voyages knowing the odds were growing worse with each convoy that sailed. Some ships made the crossing successfully, others were lost with all hands. It was a lottery where the prize was simply staying alive, and the price of a losing ticket was drowning or burning or freezing in the dark water, while the convoy sailed on, unable to stop for survivors, lest it present an even easier target. And through it all, the U-boats continued to refine their tactics. Dönitz began coordinating attacks, using long-range radio to direct multiple submarines against the same convoy, creating the Rudeltaktik or wolf pack that would dominate the next phase of the battle. One U-boat would locate a convoy and shadow it, radioing regular position reports back to headquarters in France. Other U-boats would converge on the target, gathering like wolves around a herd of prey, waiting for nightfall. Then, when darkness came, they would attack together, surfaced, approaching from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts by sheer numbers. A convoy might face 5 or 6 U-boats in a single night, each captain selecting his own targets, firing his torpedoes, then breaking off to reload and attack again. The escorts would race from one explosion to the next, dropping depth charges on submarines that were not there, while other U-boats continued the slaughter. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In July through October 1940, German U-boats sank 282 Allied ships, totaling nearly 1.5 million tons of shipping. The monthly losses averaged over 300,000 tons, far exceeding the rate at which new ships could be built. If the trend continued, Britain would be starved into submission within months, her population cut off from the food and fuel and raw materials that kept the nation functioning. And the fundamental reason for this success was simple. Submarines attacking on the surface, at night, were nearly invulnerable to the defenses available in 1940. They were too small to see reliably. They were too fast to catch. They could not be detected by sonar when surfaced. They could reload and attack again and again in a single night. The doctrine that submarines should attack from periscope depth had been proven wrong by the harsh teacher of combat experience. Kretschmer himself would later estimate that 70% of his attacks were conducted on the surface, often from inside the convoy itself. Other commanders reported similar numbers. Prien, Schepke, Joachim Mohr, Engelbert Endras, all the aces of the happy time, relied primarily on surface attacks. The submerged attack became the exception rather than the rule, used only when circumstances made surface approach impossible or when attacking heavily escorted military targets that justified the risk of diving. The engineering reality of the diesel-electric submarine had dictated tactics that no one had fully anticipated before the war. The 17-knot surface speed versus 7-knot submerged speed meant that overtaking a convoy required staying on the surface. The limited battery capacity meant that long submerged patrols were impossible. The diesel engines needed air, needed to run for hours every day to recharge batteries, which meant the submarine had to surface regularly, regardless of tactical considerations. So the smart commanders, the ones who survived and prospered, adapted to this reality. They embraced the surface attack. They learned to navigate by stars and dead reckoning, to judge distances in darkness, to fire torpedoes by eye rather than waiting for the careful calculations possible with a periscope attack. They learned to trust their lookouts, to position their boats for maximum advantage, to exploit the psychological paralysis that gripped convoy commodores when ships began exploding around them with no visible attacker. The torpedoes themselves were improving. The early magnetic pistols, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break its back, had been plagued with problems, exploding prematurely or not at all. By mid-1940, these issues were being resolved, though impact pistols remained more reliable for close-range surface attacks. The torpedoes ran true, their gyroscopes holding course, their electric motors leaving no visible wake of bubbles to betray their approach. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And the commanders developed an almost instinctive understanding of convoy geometry, of how ships moved in formation, of where gaps would open as vessels maneuvered independently in darkness. They learned to predict which way a captain would turn when he saw another ship burning, where the escorts would concentrate their attention, which columns would offer the easiest penetration. It was warfare reduced to its most fundamental elements: hunter and prey, predator and victim, darkness and fire. The happy time would not last forever. The British were not passive victims. Even as losses mounted through autumn 1940, countermeasures were being developed. Radar sets, crude and unreliable but capable of detecting surfaced submarines at several miles range in favorable conditions, began appearing on escort vessels. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, able to locate the source of U-boat radio transmissions, helped the Admiralty route convoys away from concentrations of submarines. More escorts entered service as new construction programs bore fruit. The corvettes, small anti-submarine vessels built quickly in British and Canadian shipyards, began to fill out escort groups, providing more eyes and more sonar sets to screen the convoys. Aircraft range was extended, first by basing squadrons in Iceland, then by developing longer-range versions of existing bombers. The gaps in coverage were slowly closing, and in March 1941 the tide began to turn. 3 of the great U-boat aces were lost in rapid succession. Prion and his entire crew died when U-47 was depth-charged and sunk while attacking convoy OB-293. Schepke was killed when his U-boat was rammed by the destroyer HMS Vanoc. Kretschmer himself was captured when U-99 was forced to surface after depth-charge damage, becoming a prisoner of war and spending the rest of the conflict in camps in Canada. The loss of these commanders, each responsible for sinking over 200,000 tons of shipping, was a severe blow to the U-boat arm. They were the teachers, the ones who had perfected the surface attack tactics, who had trained the next generation of commanders in the methods that worked. Their experience and skill could not be easily replaced. Moreover, the improved British defences were making surface attacks increasingly dangerous. Radar-equipped escorts could detect surfaced U-boats before they reached attack positions. Aircraft fitted with searchlights could illuminate submarines on the surface at night, forcing them to dive or face destruction. The addition of more escorts per convoy meant that there were always warships available to counterattack, to hunt down the submarines even as others continued to screen the merchant ships. By May 1941, the first happy time was effectively over. U-boat commanders were still achieving successes, still sinking merchant ships, but the easy hunting was finished. Now each attack carried real risk. Each convoy was more heavily defended, each patrol more likely to end in death or capture. The loss rate of U-boats began to climb as the sinking rate of merchant ships began to decline. But the lesson had been learned and would not be forgotten. Attacking on the surface, at night, using the submarine's superior surface speed and small silhouette, was devastatingly effective when conditions permitted. It would be the primary tactic throughout 1941 and 42, reaching its peak during the second happy time off the American coast in early 1942, when inadequate U.S. defenses allowed German submarines to repeat the slaughter that had occurred in the eastern Atlantic 18 months earlier. The fundamental engineering reality remained unchanged throughout the war. Diesel-electric submarines were faster on the surface than submerged, more maneuverable on the surface, able to see and navigate more effectively on the surface. Only late in the war, with the introduction of the Type XXI electroboot with its massive battery capacity and streamlined hull, would true high-speed submerged operation become possible. And by then, it was too late for Germany. For Kretschmer, imprisoned in Canada, the war ended early. He would survive to old age, becoming a respected figure in the post-war German Navy, honored for his skill even by former enemies. But in his most effective period, from July 1940 through March 1941, he sank 47 ships, totaling over 270,000 tons, making him the most successful U-boat commander of the war. And the vast majority of those sinkings came from surface attacks, conducted at night, often from inside the convoy itself. The irony was profound and would have been incomprehensible to naval strategists of an earlier generation. The submarine, designed as an underwater weapon, proved most deadly when operating on the surface. The vessel, built for stealth and concealment, achieved its greatest successes through bold aggression and close-range attack. The doctrine of submerged warfare, written into every manual and taught at every submarine school, was overturned by the harsh realities of engineering and tactics. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic would be decided not by any single weapon or tactic, but by the accumulation of incremental advantages on both sides. Better radar, better sonar, more escorts, longer-range aircraft, improved torpedoes, snorkel equipment that allowed submarines to run their diesels while submerged, all contributed to the shifting balance. The introduction of escort carriers in 1943, providing continuous air cover for mid-ocean convoys, finally closed the last gaps in Allied defenses. By 1944, the U-boat threat had been essentially neutralized. Individual submarines still sailed, still sank the occasional ship, but the campaign to starve Britain had failed. The wolfpacks were broken, their bases bombed, their supply lines cut. The men who survived described a grinding war of attrition, where each patrol meant facing overwhelming Allied air and sea power, where return rates fell below 50%, where serving in the U-boat arm became a statistical death sentence. But in those months of 1940 and early 1941, when the Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance and Britain's survival was genuinely in doubt, it was the surface attack that nearly won the war for Germany. It was commanders like Kretschmer exploiting the speed and maneuverability of their diesels, penetrating convoy formations under cover of darkness, firing torpedoes at point-blank range and then disappearing into the night, who brought the island nation closest to defeat. The men who sailed the merchant ships, who watched their companions die in burning oil and freezing water, who heard the explosions and felt the submarine-launched torpedoes tear through steel hulls, knew the truth. The most terrifying attacks came not from the invisible enemy lurking in the depths, but from the bold predator racing on the surface, diesel engines roaring, striking again and again throughout the long Atlantic nights. It was a lesson written in salt water and burning oil, in the mathematics of tonnage sunk and lives lost. For a crucial period in the war, the submarine captains discovered that their most effective tactic was the one that conventional wisdom had deemed most dangerous. They learned that attacking on the surface, embracing speed over concealment, aggression over caution, could turn the odds in their favor. They learned that sometimes the best way to hunt was not to hide in the depths, but to run on the surface, to use the darkness and their small silhouette and their 17-knot speed to transform the submarine from an "up next." You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.